Hey there, this is Dan and you're watching The Salty Sea. And I'm here with, I think, number 4 of creating starter lists for every warband. This time I'm going to go with Chaos. Now I'm not going to have the original Warcry warbands. That's in video number 3. I'll link that up at the top right here. But before we get into the lists, I do want to just talk about some things that I've noticed with some of the feedback to these videos. Thank you so much. It's been so positive. 500 subscribers is just an incredible number for me. I didn't think I'd get there this soon. So thank you so much for the support. Now on to notes on the lists. One thing with chaos lists is there's this giant purple elephant in the room called the Contorted Epitome, and a smaller green elephant also called Sloppity Bilepiper. So with the ally question with these lists, I am going to occasionally include them when I think it helps really a lot. But especially with the Contorted Epitome, because its ability is so powerful that it makes it something that with chaos lists, you always have to at least consider it. I'm going to start just explaining whether or not I think it belongs in the competitive lists that I talk about. Some of them it will, some of them it won't, and I'll just make a quick statement on that for each one. Finally, with budget lists, once again, just a reminder that there is a balance here between the absolute cheapest list and what I would say is the best starting point. So as often as possible, I'm going to give something that's cheaper than the start collecting box, but still giving you sort of a reasonable warband. And in those cases where you could do that or the start collecting, I'll talk about that and I'll mention that whether or not the start collecting gives a good start to the range. Then finally, I just wanted to say a word on sort of competitive versus casual lists. For some reason in a lot of games, and it seems like Warcry is no exception really, there's almost sort of a pros versus Joes dynamic, or this idea that the competitive and casual sides of the game have to be sort of at odds with one another. I don't think that's true at all, and I think especially with Warcry, where the barrier to entry is a little bit lower a lot of the time. The ways to get into the game, even the cheapest, just getting a couple boxes, it still gives you sort of a way to make a hard tuned list and a way to make slightly maybe a sillier or tuned down list. I just want to put both because I find competitive theory crafting with this game really interesting. I think the game is really good for it, but I do think it's somewhat solvable right now. There aren't necessarily the rock, paper, scissors tools at the top of the metagame. Certainly when we see more tournaments happen, we'll find that out, whether I'm right or wrong about that. But then I also just want to, put in words about casual lists for people who, maybe they're not interested in min-maxing, or maybe they have done that or know as much about that as they need to and would like something to not just stomp everyone at their LGS. So, I'm just trying to say that putting both of them in this list is not, or in these videos is not to make a value judgment of one or the other. So let's get into Beasts of Chaos. Now, right away, I'm going to sort of break my own rules with this because there are so many different budget ways to jump into this faction. So I'll start by just saying that the start collecting is a great option, giving you lots of Ungors and Vestigors. But there's other ways to do it too. So I wanted to talk about 2 of them. So the first is getting a box of Gors and then a third-party Doom Bull. The Games Workshop Doom Bull, a lot of people love the sculpt. I get it. It's a good sculpt, but there are third-party ones which have just as much detail and I think almost as dynamic a pose for about half the price. And so if you get one of those third-party ones, and I'll link in the cards up in the top right, there's a video I have where I talk about specifically Beasts of Chaos on a budget. But if you get one of those third-party ones and just a box of Gors, you've got an extremely competitive warband with just $60. You'll notice that the budget one for that is only a couple pieces different than the competitive one. So the next option is if you get Grashrax Despoilers, and a box of Bulgors. That's also cheaper than the start collecting and also gives you a really nice functional warband. Um, the Great Bray Shaman has a really great disruptive ability for messing up opponents. And then, you've got those Ungor Raiders as sort of chaff with, some range with them. And then Bulgors can be your heavy hitters. You can also do, I think Dragon Ogres are a little bit more expensive than Bulgors, but you could do the exact same thing with Dragon Ogres and fit 2 Dragon Ogres along with Grashrax Despoilers. And I think that'll be really fun for a lot of folks because, the Underworld's warbands just paint up so well, right? They're all such great painting pieces. Finally, for playing this warband competitively, I would go with a Doombull and a Cockatrice as sort of your heavy hitters. The Doombull move 5, but it wins almost every fight it can get in. And move 5 is still pretty quick. And then Cockatrice is your 10-inch flyer that can fly around the board. It's not quite as good a fighter as the Doombull, but it'll do those objective grabbing missions. It'll still blow up most chaff units. And then Beast of Chaos just has the capacity to flood the board with a ton of chaff. Gore with 2 weapons are actually really good. And then I like having 2 Ungor Raiders to put in the 2 warbands, or sorry, 2 deployment groups that aren't your shield, just so that you have an option that can affect the fight wherever it is. Because so often you have a couple deployment groups that aren't on the battlefield right away. Whether this would be better with the Contorted Epitome, it might be if you dropped a Cockatrice and a Gore for the Contorted, but it's pretty close. It is effective running a Contorted with another giant heavy hitter like a Doombull. The only issue there is that the Cockatrice is already giving you, some of that mobility advantage that the Contorted would give you. So you're really just giving up flying and another body in order to get that ability, which often will be valuable, but Cockatrices are so good that maybe you don't really need it. So next we come to sort of the poster boy villains of Warhammer. These were in the very original starter set with Age of Sigmar, so a lot of folks have Khorne Mortals, and if you did get started with that original starter set, or if you have gotten the Start Collecting, which is the same kit of units, that's a great entry point. I've got a full guide to everything Khorne Mortals before the Grand Alliance books that I'll link here, and that shows a great list that you can make with just the Start Collecting box. But there are other ways to get into it. So one really cool thing with Khorne is that if you combine the 2 Underworlds warbands, they actually give you a Warcry warband, which I just think is wonderful. I wish every Chaos God faction had something like this, or honestly every faction with 2 different sorts of units had something like this. So you could have Magor and Garrick as Blood Warrior champions and Reaver champions, and then all the rest of them just kind of fit, right? There's a Fleshhound and Magor's Fiends and 2 Blood Warriors, and then there's also just 4 Blood Reavers in Garrick's crew. And so that gives you a really functional, great warband. You've got mobility, you've got some heavy hitters, you've got some of the better chaff units in the game with the Blood Reaver with 2 weapons. Yes, Blood Reavers with the big axe are just kind of worse in most respects than the ones with 2 weapons, but as far as a quick start, this is great, and I'm sure some of you will have opponents that are willing to change that via proxy. Now, if I was going to do this competitively, one cool thing about Khorne Mortals is I don't think that warband is fully solved yet, but the way I would start would be a Wrathmonger champion. I just think that even though they released a whole bunch of new heroes for Khorne, I don't think any of them are quite better than the Wrathmonger champ that was already there. It's an incredible piece in terms of how much damage it does with range 2. Then you've got the Korgorath, which I think is a really good bruiser and really hard to take down. And then Skulltaker is sort of a mid-sized unit, but it has a nice ability, and then you could put in 6 Blood Reavers with 2 axes. Adding a Contorted would probably make this warband better, but maybe not, which is why I haven't put it here. You're making a trade-off of board control versus damage. the Contorted giving you that lockdown ability, but you'd have to remove a Skull Taker and a Korgorath for a Contorted and a couple Blood Reavers. And so, that gives you more numbers to throw across the board, but at the price of, the Korgorath is just such a great bruiser, and the Skull Taker doesn't do that great damage on its own, but when it's using its triple, it's very effective. Finally, for a sweet kind of silly list, if you've got the Korgoraths to do it, playing sort of the Monstars is really sweet. So I highlighted this in the guide I did with Khorne Mortals, but since then they've gotten even more tools to do this with, in that you have a Bloodstoker, which combos with the Korgoraths to give them an extra attack. And then also, you want just a Blood Reaver here to just run around to grab objectives too. So just 5 models in this one, but if you love Korgoraths, it's perfect. Though there's actually quite a few meme lists possible with Khorne Mortals. So for example, the Bloodsecrator bomb, if you just do a Bloodsecrator and all Blood Reavers with big axes, that one's pretty funny too, and can also sometimes just overwhelm people in the missions where numbers matter. And then there's actually sort of build around units all over their heroes lists in terms of the Mighty Lord of Khorne, the Slaughter Priests, the Jugger Lords, I call them, the Lord of Khorne on Juggernaut. There's a ton of leaders that are almost as good as the Wrathmonger champion, just not quite. And you can build around any of them, which I think makes the Khorne range really sweet. So next we have Khorne Demons. And for those of you who have followed the channel, you'll know that I've mentioned a few times that the Wrath and Rapture box of Khorne versus Slaanesh really cemented me as a Warhammer fan back in the day, and Khorne Demons were actually the very first faction that I uploaded a guide for on the channel. Now, the Start Collecting box isn't bad. If you can somehow find that Wrath and Rapture box, the Khorne half gives a really good start to the warband, but so does the Start Collecting. There's also a cheaper option with just getting Blood Letters and the Bloodmaster, the Herald of Khorne. And that's only 66 bucks, so you could do a Bloodmaster and then a Blood Reaper, who is the Blood Letter hero, and then just 9 Blood Letters. That warband would do just a ton of damage. Both of the on-foot Khorne leaders do way more damage for their points than most leaders do. They're just sort of fragile and immobile. And then the same is true of Blood Letters. They have some of the best damage per point of any unit in the game. They're just kind of immobile and not very hard to kill. Now, as far as getting competitive, you still want a lot of Blood Letters, so I've got 5 of them here. But for my money, the Gorehound is one of the absolute best sort of heavy-hitting units in the game. So for 205 points, you get a ton of damage for what its cost is, and then 8-inch move, almost as valuable as 10. It doesn't have the mount keyword, so it can still get up on terrain with that movement. And then it's even got a movement ability, Hungry for Flesh, that lets it sort of project across the board in ways that your opponent just won't be guessing. And then its quad is a great burn spell that basically no one can hide from. So I think trying to get 2 into a list is really valuable. You can go for a cheaper leader and then a Fleshhound instead of the second Gorehound so that you can get more Blood Letters in if you're worried about numbers. But I just think once you play with a Gorehound, you'll never look back and you'll want more of them. The Blood Hunter is just the Blood Crusher leader, and it's a solid piece. It deals enough damage to oftentimes one-hit kill chaff models. It's got a reasonable amount of movement at 6, and then it's just really hard to kill. Would you want Contorted Epitome in this? I don't think you would, just because Gorehounds are just such an incredible piece in terms of what they can do. I don't think the Contorted Epitome is really adding much here. Now, if you go for a sweet list, a ton of people ask, this seems to happen every month or so on either the Reddit or the Discord. They look at the Slaves to Darkness leaders and they ask, like, how do I make this Knights of Chaos ability work? This is the one where either your Chaos Lord on Demonic Mount or your Chaos Lord on Karkadrak, either one of them can pump up the movement ability of mounted units nearby. Now, the issue with that is that Chaos Knights and Chaos Marauders, which is how it would work in Slaves to Darkness, they already have 10-inch movement. They don't need the extra movement, and then they're just not very good pieces once they get into the fight. Now, that's not really true of the Khorne Demon mounted units. So the Blood Crusher and the Blood Hunter, they're only at 6-inch movement, which is really low for mounted units. And then they're actually pretty good fighters once they start fighting. They're really hard to kill. And then they also, especially the Blood Hunter, deal reasonable damage. And so pumping them up is just much more valuable. So I actually think if you're looking at Slaves to Darkness and wondering what's the best way to run these mounted Chaos Lords, the answer is Khorne Demons, because I think that they use the buff much better, and then they do more once they've got it. So running 2 of the Khorne Demon mounted units next to a Chaos Lord ally in one deployment group, and then just 2 Bloodletters each in your other 2 deployment groups, I think is a great way to leverage this warband and have a great time doing it. So now we get into Nurgle Mortals, who are sort of the meme faction for sort of, quote, worst faction in the game. They might not be actually the worst. There are a few others that are on their level, and there's there's stuff you can do with them. So first of all, I do want to just say that there's not really better ways to get into the faction than just grabbing the Start Collecting box. Even just getting the sort of Blight Lords box doesn't quite get you to a full warband, which is a bit of a shame. So the best way to do it is probably with the Start Collecting. That lets you run a Lord of Afflictions along with just your box of Blight Kings. And that'll be pretty effective as far as effective can be termed with this warband. Now, if I was trying to be competitive with them, which I think you should with Nurgle Mortals, right? Because and this is why I've got 2 competitive lists instead of a casual list. When you're running a low-tier warband, you're sort of playing a casual list already, so you may as well, in my opinion at least, you may as well just try to get as competitive as you can. And then your opponents probably won't notice too much. So I actually, instead of bringing the Contorted Epitome, because what the Contorted does is it runs forward, kills a chaff unit, and then locks down their most important piece, but it can still get surrounded if its allies are all too slow to catch up to it. So you don't really want it with such a slow warband as Nurgle Mortals. So what I would do instead is the Enlightened Aviarch on disc. It's a little harder to kill than the Contorted, and it's a 10-inch move flyer, so it helps fix this mobility problem that Nurgle Mortals have. And then you can run that with a Blight Lord, and then 3 Blight Kings, and then the Blight King with Bell, who is, I think, sort of necessary for this warband because of the 1-inch move he gives. So I do think the Enlightened Aviarch on disc is really solving a lot of the problems that Nurgle Mortals have with moving quickly. Now, if you don't want to bring in an ally, but you still want to just run a tuned version of this list, you can do it. The Lord of Plagues is an incredible fighter for his points, so you can use him, and then a Puscoil Blight Lord for the movement. Those move 6 inches, which isn't bad, and they can fly, so that's okay. And then you're going to have your Blight King with Bell, of course, and then 3 sort of just regular Blight Kings. I would say that this is, if I was going to run it with no ally, this is how I would do it. So the demon side of Nurgle actually doesn't have some of the issues that the Mortals do as far as tools to overcome their slowness. So the Start Collecting box is a great option for getting into Nurgle Demons, but you can do it even cheaper than that. If you just get a box of Plague Bearers and a box of Nurglings, that'll be $70. So, $20 or so cheaper than the Start Collecting, and it'll get you a really functional warband. The Nurglings have move 5, so they can kind of get across the board much more effectively, and then, once the Plague Bearers catch up, Plague Bearers are just really good in combat. And then the Plague Ridden is just one of the cheapest leaders you can get, which is always nice because, leaders pay a tax for what they can do point for point. So you know, sometimes if you're not getting a good ability, you just want to have as few points tied up in your leader as possible. If I was going to run them competitively, I would lean towards Sloppity Bile Piper and a pile of Nurglings. So Sloppity costs 165, and then you compare it with a Nurgling, a Beast of Nurgle, and 10 Plague Bearers for just a ton of numbers. Some of your Plague Bearers are going to you know, be able to overcome that move 3 issue. And then Beast of Nurgle and Nurglings both can move a little quicker and, you know, present a real threat. Especially the Beast of Nurgle can really frustrate your opponents. Would the Contorted Epitome add to this list? I think it would. Honestly, if you took out the sort of Nurgling and 3 Plague Bearers, I think it would add something, but it wouldn't be that much better. So you don't need it. It's not absolutely necessary, but I do think it would add something. You can also just replace a Beast of Nurgle with a Spoilpox Scrivener, which can just turn all the Plague Bearers nearby it to just absolute monsters. So that can be something that's valuable to you. It's not as good a fighter on its own as the Beast of Nurgle is, so it's just a little bit of a trade-off there, but it's worth considering. As far as sweet things you can do with Nurgle Demons, there's a few, but my favorite one, I think I've highlighted this on one of my sort of janky holiday videos before, but the Cypher Lord's Thrall Master has a cool ability. It can teleport any sort of minion keyword unit across the board. And there's not very many of those, but one of them is Nurglings. So if you bring the Thrall Master into your Nurgle Demons list, this is another way to kind of get around the mobility problems that the faction has. Ooh, we've got a plane flying overhead. Hopefully that's not ruining the audio too much for you guys. But yeah, so if you bring a Poxbringer, who is sort of a really good point-for-point fighter that you have access to, it doesn't have great abilities on its own, but here you don't need them because you're going to be using your dice on your Thrall Master. And then 3 Nurglings, and then 3 Plague Bearers to give you some numbers. The real trick with this list is just going to be teleporting your Nurglings across the board with your Thrall Master and keeping your opponent guessing. So let's get into Slaanesh, and we'll start with the mortal side. Now, it's kind of hard to find a way to really get into this warband cheaply. That's almost always true of new warbands, new factions that GW comes out with. They wait a long time before they give you any kind of value box for them. So if you can find the Dread Pageant half of Beastgrave, or sorry, it's not Beastgrave, it's like Dreadfane or something, whatever the current Underworld's starter box is, if you can find that half on eBay, and then add it to a Blissbarb box, a box of Blissbarb archers, that gives you actually a pretty functional warband, because you can use the Dread Pageant leader as a Lord of Pain, and then your Blissbarb box gives you sort of the Blissbarb archer leader, and then you get a Fiend Blood in with the Dread Pageant, and then it also has a Blissbarb archer, and then that'll go with 5 that you got from the box. So that's a pretty functional warband. It does take some tracking down to get there, but that's probably the cheapest way to build something functional out of Slaanesh Mortals. Just getting a box of Blissbarb archers, in my opinion, doesn't really do it. So now, as far as getting competitive with them, this is another one where, I think these might be a little better than Nurgle Mortals, but not by much. That's not to denigrate them. I still think they're really cool, really sweet, but I'm going to do 2 attempts at being competitive with them instead of just one in a casual list, just because I think that that's worth it when you're looking at low-tier warbands. So, in my opinion, you're kind of building around one of 2 of the things in this warband that are actually still pretty powerful. And so that's either going to be Slangors or the Lord of Pain. So if I was going around Slangors, I think that's the easiest way to fit in a Contorted Epitome. When you're playing the Epitome, it's pretty easy to kill, so you want to have at least one other big threat in your warband that your opponent also wants to kill. And so the Slangor Slakehorn, who is the Fiend Blood leader, I think he really fits that bill really nicely. And then you can also include another Fiend Blood, and then a Twin Soul with the Lash, that's the one with the 3-inch reach, which is pretty useful, and then 3 Blissbarb Archers. You're not huge on numbers here, but you have the Disruption of the Epitome, and it's more on theme than it is in a lot of other lists that you would slide it into, since it's just from the Demons half of Slaanesh. And then you have the ability to kind of keep up with it with your Slangors, which keeps it from getting surrounded as easily. So I think it can really add a lot of value here. The other way to do it, let's say without any ally and just kind of working the warband differently, is to try to maximize the Paragon of Depravity ability. So the Lord of Pain has the ability to add to the strength of everybody nearby, and there's a lot of units that would be really hard hitting if they weren't strength 3. And so I think that's really, a nice combo. So if I was going to build around the Lord of Pain, I would include at least one Myrmidesh Painbringer. Those have, solid point for point damage, but the strength 3 does bring them down a little bit. So the Lord of Pain really helps there. And then the same is true with the Twin Souls with Lash. I also really like having a little bit of range poke that still counts within the buff range whenever I'm having one of these AoE buffs, because having those guys just increases the threat bubble when you do that, right? Because let's say you pop your Lord of Pain ability, he's got 2-inch reach, he's attacking something that's 2 inches away from him, then your Twin Soul is 3 inches away from your Lord of Pain, but attacking something that's 3 inches away from it. All of a sudden, this short bubble has just been increased by, 4 inches, which I think is really helpful for using it sort of in-game. Finally, if you do want an actual meme list with Slaanesh Mortals, it can be done. The Fiend Bloods have the ferocious keyword, the same that Korgoraths do. And so if you bring in a Bloodstoker as an ally, you can do some really cool stuff. I have a video where I talk about sort of the Slangor Circus, and I'll post that here up at the top if you want some discussion on sort of a meme list for Slaanesh Mortals. So then moving to the other side of Slaanesh with the Demons. This was also, the other half of that Wrath and Rapture box that made me love this game so much. So I would say the best budget way to get a functional warband out of them would be to get a box of Demonettes and a box of Seekers of Slaanesh. The Heartseeker is the Slaanesh, I spelled that wrong there, but it's the Slaanesh Seeker leader, and it's actually a really solid leader for its points. And then you can include 2 other Seekers, and then 7 Demonettes. This is really going on the kind of speed kills aspect of Slaanesh. This is sort of how Slaanesh classically plays in sort of other versions of Warhammer, and I think you'll have a lot of fun with this budget list. It essentially gives you everything the Start Collecting would give you. It just doesn't have that Exalted Chariot, which if you're not here for Age of Sigmar, you really just don't need. Then if we're getting competitive, I think that the competitive list, it is solved, so sort of everyone knows what it is by now, but a Contorted Epitome, 2 Fiends, and 6 Demonettes. I think this list is going to be a great time for anyone who loves playing Control. And, there's just so much disruption at your fingertips with this list in terms of your Fiend's ability to go attack something and then lock it down from not being able to disengage or move. And so then the Contorted Epitome, of course, can just, delete an opponent's things from acting this round. And so your opponent is going to have just so little freedom to work with while fighting you. And then, your Demonettes do a ton of damage and have move 5 to get across the board. So they will win the fight that you need to have and to win. And then your Contorted Epitome and your Fiends will stop your opponent from ever being able to fight back on you. So this list, in my opinion, is sort of one of the meta tournament lists that you can run. And, Slaanesh Demons is the way to do it. It is kind of funny because it doesn't really act the way Slaanesh acts in Age of Sigmar, but that's okay, right? Because it's still a really evocative and really interesting way to play Warcry. For doing sort of the same idea, but a little bit more casually, you can just run 2 Infernal Enraptresses. Might have pronounced that wrong, but the Enraptress can reduce the number of attacks for everything within a bubble around it. So if you put 2 Infernal Enraptresses on the board and sort of move them up, you can create these zones where your opponent is just barely doing any damage. And the way it's written, having 2 of those bubbles overlapping does stack in anywhere where they overlap. So your opponent's going to be able to play around that, certainly, because it's going to take you multiple activations to set it up. But still, if you do catch them out, if they forget about it, you should certainly tell them before the game that that's possible. But if they forget about it mid-game, you can basically reduce their damage practically to 0. Then you've also got a Fiend for the disruption that provides, and then your Seeker and Demonettes can zip across the board, doing damage and just getting to objectives. So this will be a slightly more casual version of what the really competitive list does, but it's kind of playing on the same axis. So if you fall in love with the Slaanesh Warcry sort of speed control playstyle, sort of like almost like Delver if you ever play Magic. This will be a way to do it without just stomping everyone you come across, and that can be really valuable if you love the playstyle. So now let's get into Tzeentch. The Trixie Boys don't have a value box that you can get into, so and they also, yeah, it's tough with getting into Tzeentch. However, getting a box of Carrick Acolytes does at least produce a reasonable warband because they've got so many different options for weapons. So if you have a Carrick Acolyte leader, the one with the bird, and then 2 of the ones with scrolls, and then a bunch with 2 swords, that's a pretty functional warband. You've got 10 models, no really heavy hitters, but it's still valuable to have them. Now, as far as getting competitive, I don't really rate the Carrick Acolytes as high as, say, the Zangors, which I think are really good as far as just how much damage they do and the fact that they all have move 5. So if I was going to play them competitively, I would bring in an Enlightened Aviarch on disc. That's the kind of Zangor guys who fly on discs. And then 2 Zangors with Great Blades, and then 7 Zangors with the 2 swords. The Great Blades do considerably more damage for their points, though they do cost a lot more. So I wouldn't want to spam just them. And one thing I like about this list is I wouldn't add a Contorted Epitome to it. The Enlightened Aviarch is already doing so many things for you that I think the Contorted would overlap a little bit with. The only shame here is you don't have great ways to use your dice, but your universal abilities are still valuable. As far as a sweet, sort of casual way to run Tzeentch Mortals, you can try this Nerd Rage list that I showed in one of my sort of janky list videos, but I just want to highlight it again here. Your Ogroid Thaumaturge is a really cool piece in Tzeentch Mortals, and it can run forward, and if it's taken a bunch of damage, its damage just explodes for the rest of the game. So if you run it forward, it combos nicely with the Carrick Acolyte with the bird, because the bird can prevent the opponent from disengaging. So you can run forward with your Ogroid. They don't want to attack it because they don't want to see its damage turn crazy. So they're really incentivized to kind of just disengage and run away from it. And that's where your Carrick Acolyte comes in, because it can stop the disengage and force them to fight it. Then I like putting in a Varangard ally. I think Varangards are sweet, and their ability really requires you to have rolled good dice, but the Tzeentch ability, that is mostly really terrible and does nothing for Tzeentch, is really good for pumping the dice value of the Varangard ability up above 6, which I think is really sweet, and lets the Varangard just explode for damage. So This is a really good anti-elite warband. Unfortunately, at the competitive level, you don't really see more than 2 elites in any warbands, but you know, if that ever changes, this will be a legitimate list. One just note on me not putting the Carrick Acolytes in either of these 2 lists is I don't really rate them, and we can talk about it more also as we move on to the demons. Getting the most mileage out of Tzeentch, if you're running Carrick Acolytes on the mortal side, or if you're running horrors on the demon side, is really going to be about knowing whether to use their bad melee ability or whether to use their bad ranged ability. So all the chaff units for Tzeentch Demons and then just the Carrick side of Tzeentch Mortals, they all have 2 different disappointing attacks, and maybe a better player than I would know sort of when to rely on which in any given situation and get a little bit more mileage out of them. But as far as sort of point for point damage, I find that neither of them are really as effective as they could be if they only had 1 attack. But let's get into Tzeentch Demons anyway. So now if we are going to get into Tzeentch Demons, the Start Collecting box is an option, but in my opinion not a very good one because it gives you pink horrors, but not blue horrors. And the one really nice thing about Tzeentch Demons is that split ability where a pink horror, a 90-point unit, can split into 2 75-point units for 2 blue horrors. So I would actually suggest that instead of the Start Collecting, if you're interested in Tzeentch Demons, to pick up the Broken Realms box that just came out for them. I think it's called Atrazan's Cavalcade. It's $80, so you'll save a little bit of money off the Start Collecting. And it's cool because it gives you a chariot that can be constructed differently to give you instead just a regular chariot and then a change caster on foot. And the change caster is nice because it's actually Tzeentch's cheapest demon hero, which is really nice. And then you can just use a ton of horrors from it. So start with 3 pink horrors, they can split into blues, and then fill it out with 10 brimstone horrors. That's just an incredible amount of bodies. Like I said before, your mileage is going to vary with how effective horrors are in your hands. They're one of the most skill testing units in the game. But if you get good with them, you can do real things with this budget list here. Now, if I was going to do this competitively, though, I would want to bring in Flamers. The Exalted Flamer specifically is one of the harder hitting ranged units in the game, and certainly available to the Chaos Allegiance. So I would bring in 2 Exalted Flamers to just machine gun your opponent's important targets down, and then fill it out with just a pink horror and some brimstone horrors. I think that that's going to be really good for certain missions where, say, you need to take out a specific model of your opponents. It's going to be really difficult if you just have those 2 Exalted Flamers on the field and you're just sort of burning them down from range. That can be really powerful with this warband. Then the other way you could do it is if you wanted to bring in a Contorted Epitome, you could include a Pyrocaster who is, a little bit less damage, a little easier to kill than the Exalted Flamers, but he does get to have the leader keyword. And then you'd have a Contorted Epitome, and then an Exalted Flamer, and then just a bunch of horrors to fill it out. I think that this is a little bit more effective probably, even though you are losing your best piece, which is that extra Exalted Flamer. Just because, the Contorted does what the Contorted does. No need to talk too much about that, but that's just talking about a different way to run Tzeentch competitively. This is one of the lower tier warbands, so, if I'm across the table from you, I would just say no holds barred as far as, what you can try to include in your warband. So now we're getting from one of the lowest to maybe the highest tier warband, and that is Skaven. So if you can find the Warcry box for Skaven, I think it's sold out in most places, but if you can do that, that's a great way to get into this faction. But let's say you can't find it. I couldn't find it when I was just, looking around before this video. Um, one way to do it is just a box of Plague Monks. This is sort of a boogeyman budget list because it's just so strong. Plague Monks are incredible. They have really high damage. They can disengage for free with dice. You do have to roll for it, but it's just such a powerful ability if you hit it. And then, Skaven have that amazing sort of plus attacks bubble where it's not just +1 attack, it's plus multiples. And then the Plague Monks with staves, sure they do a little less damage than the knives, but they have all of the advantages that range 2 give you, except that they actually do really incredible damage, on their own. So as far as budget lists go, this is certainly the strongest and one of the scariest in the game. Now, if you're going competitive with Skaven, just the Plague Monk spam box already is a competitive warband. You could take that to a tournament and win. But to make it even scarier, you just add the Molder box. So a Rat Ogre, 5 Giant Rats come in that box, and then add in a Packmaster to combo with the Rat Ogre. That gives you a little bit more of a punch in one place with the Rat Ogre because it can be nice to have just have one really heavy hitter. And then the Giant Rats let you keep up your numbers even though you're adding that punch. And then you still have all these Plague Monks to get a bunch of sort of benefit the same way they normally do. I would keep it with the staves if I was doing it this way. And then I like having a Plague Priest because the bubble on your multiple attack buff is pretty small. So the Plague Priest has range 2, and then if you have all the Plague Monks with range 2, then just like I said with the guys with lashes for Slaanesh, having the extra range makes the bubble effectively larger, which can be really nice in a lot of game situations. Would you want to add a contorted epitome to this list? Hell no. No, not even close. Skaven is one of the few factions where their pieces are just more powerful than anything that contorted does, right? Like you would actually rather have the Skaven triple given this warband. In a lot of other warbands with fewer models, you wouldn't rather have the Skaven triple, but for Skaven in particular, you would rather have that triple than even the contorted epitome's incredible triple. And then, you don't need the extra mobility it provides because everything in your warband is move 6, except the Rat Ogre, which I think is move 5, but that's pretty close. Now, I asked some Skaven people before this. In general, just there isn't huge consensus on whether or not you want 1 or 2 Rat Ogres. So I've presented a 1 Rat Ogre list, but I've presented multiple versions of the Molder plus Pestilence scary Skaven list, over the last few months with my videos, whether it was in my top combos list or top heavyweights list. There's a lot of different ways to decide on the exact composition of units. You could replace the Packmaster with a Master Molder and then drop the Plague Priest if you wanted to try to fit in a second Rat Ogre. Lots of things you can do just playing around the margins of what the perfect competitive Skaven list looks like, but they're all sort of on the same theme. You take your Pestilence, you take your Molder, you stick them together, you have the scariest warband in the game. Is it possible to play Skaven without, just raffle stomping all of your opponents? It is. So this Scryer list can kind of do that. Warp Fire Throwers can be really frustrating for a lot of people, but because they aren't just terrible. But this list, it's not flooding the board with bodies, just 7, but it also runs a Storm Fiend with Doomflare Gauntlets, which, if it weren't for the Rat Ogre plus Packmaster combo, I think people would still be complaining about Skaven almost as much, just because Storm Fiends with Doomflare Gauntlets are incredible pieces. They are, really hard to kill and just do an absurd amount of damage, and they have good movement. So this lets you bring in a Storm Fiend, get a ton of mileage off that, and then, rush it forward and be shooting and peppering at your opponent otherwise. Also, the Warp Grinder, point for point, is really a solid unit. Overshadowed by those Plague Monks and Giant Rats, but just a really great piece on its own. One of the best mid-sized pieces in the game. All right, finally we're getting to the end here, and we are going to talk about Marauders to Darkness. So getting into Marauders to Darkness on a budget is probably the best way to do it is to get a box of Marauders and an Exalted Hero of Chaos. So those can be had for like 15 bucks. It's really cool how many sort of old GW sculpts there are for Chaos Heroes. And this is sort of the theme of this warband in general, is they have, almost 10 really good heroes that you can build a warband around. And then, the reason I don't call them Slaves to Darkness is because they just have this really awesome chaff unit with Marauders, and then not much else as far as useful units are concerned. So that's why the best way to get into it is just a box of Marauders and then one hero that you buy. And that'll make a really solid warband. Really the only flaw for this warband is that the mobility problem, right? There's no, it's move 4 across the board, though your flails will make up for that somewhat by being range 3. So if I was going to play them competitively, I would really just be looking to solve the mobility problem, because outside of mobility, they're already a competitive warband because Marauders with flails are just so good. So I would probably bring in the Chaos Lord. They have a ton of solid options for their leader, but I think the Chaos Lord is the most solid. Just does a ton of damage and is really hard to kill. And then the Contorted Epitome, you're going to be, I'm sure you're sick of hearing it by now, but the Contorted Epitome slots perfectly into this list, just because it has so much movement. And then, like I said a couple times before, the best way to run it is generally when there's another piece that they're also really scared of, so that focusing all their guys onto the Contorted Epitome doesn't pay off for them because you've got another thing they wish they could kill. And the Chaos Lord fits that bill perfectly. Then you have the Marauders, which, being so slow, they do have a tough time keeping up with the Contorted, but again, the 3-inch move helps there. You can also, if you're sick of hearing about Contorted Epitomes, you can flip it with a Sloppity Bile Piper, and you could run one more Marauder that way. And that also helps fix the mobility problem, because now your Marauders are moving more quickly. You can set them up round 1 really nicely to just have this overlapping area of influence where all their flails, 3-inch range, are just all overlapping together, so that there's this no-go zone where any valuable target that enters this area is going to be aggressed on by like 5 different Marauders, even though they're not particularly close to each other. All of a sudden you step into a place and all the overlapping bubbles show that you're in range of everybody. So that can be really helpful, and makes Slaves to Darkness kind of secretly one of the more powerful warbands. Not all the way up there next to Skaven or Slaanesh, but still up there. Now, if you're running them casually, I sort of included a Sloppity Bile Piper here to still show other ways to solve the mobility issue. But you could certainly switch them out for more Marauders or more Chaos Warriors. I do think the Chaos Warrior with 2 weapons, it's not terrible. So it's got a little more armor than you need, but at least it's hard to kill. And then that one actually does do respectable damage. Still just has that move 4 issue. So here we're solving the mobility problem by having a Varangard, which I talked about before in the Tzeentch list, as just such a cool unit. You don't really need a Tzeentch ally, but you could bring one in instead of Sloppity, and I think that would really help your Varangard out, using the Tzeentch ability to pump its damage. But otherwise, here we're bringing in Sloppity to make our Marauders and our Chaos Warriors a little faster, and then that way they can kind of keep up with the Varangard. The Varangard is just a piece that can just go anywhere it wants on the board, win almost any fight, other than a few ogre heroes, um, I'm not sure there's really anything that's gonna beat up your Varangard, or really pose really a threat to it at all. So if you do love having just one piece that's just like the biggest bully on the board, um, the Varangard is the perfect piece for that. Wow. So there's a lot of factions in Chaos. So if you bore with me for that whole video, thank you so much. Please, give me a like, and if you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so. Going to be finishing up this series with Order pretty soon. Order is going to be another really big one. So, those first three videos were certainly the two smallest, and then this one and the next one are the biggest ones. Um, but really excited to be finishing it off. I'm thinking afterwards, I'm going to dip my toe into the tier list thing. I'll just tier up all of the lists that I made for this. So, I'll enter into an algorithm, sort of the budget, competitive, and casual lists to kind of show you, how these lists stack up against each other, and I'll make a little video on that. Certainly, Rido has stamped that territory as his own, and I, totally respect that. I love his tier list videos. It'll be fun to kind of add some debate to the subject. But that's going to be, a while, because I am going to start with just starter lists on Order next, and then we've actually got a ton of previews coming up that GW has just announced, so I'll probably be talking about those before I jump into tier listing, just because I think it's going to be a little like drinking from a fire hose here. So I'm interested in talking about that, and maybe a little bit about how production delays from the pandemic have kind of changed GW's plan going forward for sort of Warcry, AOS, all of that. So you can look forward to that, and until it happens, may all your rolls be crits.